This is Martin Giles of the Guildford Dragon News, and I'm with Cllr Jan Harwood, the Conservative councillor for Merrow. Councillor Harwood shocked all those with an awareness of Guildford's local politics when in November he decided to quit the Liberal Democrats for the Conservatives at Guildford Borough Council. And today he's volunteered to be interviewed about the decision and its consequences. Welcome to the Dragon, Jan.
Hello, nice to be back.
Okay, and let's get straight into it then. Well, obviously, I can't avoid a question on last night's news. Everyone will be aware of last night's heavy, well, I guess most people at least will be aware of last night's heavy defeat by the Conservative Party in the North Staffordshire by-election. Of course, it comes on the back of several other bad news items concerning your new party. The parties at Downing Street, the PM breaking the rules to have his flat redecorated, and a massive dissent within his own ranks in Parliament over the latest COVID restrictions. Your switch could not have been made at a worse time, could it?
No, I don't think it's possible to have picked a worse time in many ways. But I mean, I've been very honest up front about this. I joined the Conservative Party not because of what it currently is, but what it could be. And I've been fairly vocal in the past of my opinions on the current administration. And I think that last night's result was a very clear message by the public that the current trajectory of the Conservative Party is not good enough. So we'll see what
Okay, well, that's very frank. And I'd like to come on to that towards the end of the interview, how you see the future. But I do want to reflect a bit about your decision, because looking at the local situation and issues, what was it that triggered your decision to make the switch of allegiance and political philosophy? I mean, it is a big jump. Was there a single event? You were, after all, a senior figure in the Lib Dem party, one who had managed Zoe Franklin's campaign in the last general election.
Yeah, it wasn't a singular event. I've been fairly dissatisfied for some time, quite vocally so, in fact. I suspect that many people who are in the same building will have noticed over the course of the last year. And to be very blunt, I actually thought about resigning and just walking away from the whole thing shortly after Caroline left, Councillor Reeves, because she was a big part of my support structure in coping with a lot of the difficult elements. But a sense of duty kept me on, and having decided that quitting was not the right thing to do, I had to do whatever I thought was in the best interests of the people I represent, and would move things forward in a way. So to give a specific answer of what made me make the move, I find the local Liberal Democrats to be ineffective. It's as simple as that. Not willing to really face the reality of what needs to happen. One of my biggest frustrations with my previous party was there was a lack of really a vision of what they wanted. I'd struggled to identify what it is the Liberal Democrats in Guildford actually want. And I've been telling this to them internally for some time, and keep driving for some consensus or some attempt to build a strong list of desires. You know, we can always talk about things like the manifesto pledges, which we actually largely know to be written in a mindset of opposition as opposed to someone who might have one day run the council. So there's some very questionable pledges there.
Well, including the 3,000 social houses, for instance. Which
I mean, if you want to open that can of worms, I'm happy to start with that one. That was one of the biggest frustrations I had was that sword hanging over my head as I took the portfolio, and I asked them, how am I supposed to deliver this? And the answer was, well, we don't really know. We just put that in because we thought it would sound good. And it was incredibly frustrating. And one of my biggest regrets, for example, is declaring a climate emergency. It's one of my biggest regrets of my entire time in the council. Because
okay, well, we'll come on to that a bit later on, Jan. But you said in your opinion piece published in the Dragon that you have never truly belonged to any political party. Yeah. Do you now belong to the Conservative Party? Presumably, you are a signed-up member.
Well, it's part of the requirement to be a part of the group. Belong to is a very strong word. My opinions and my political views are not defined by the party I choose to work with. I have a set of principles I work to, and I will work with anyone who I think will help me accomplish the objectives I set out. And I'm always very upfront and open about what those objectives are. And in this case, I have a very keen interest. It's not my only interest, but I have a very strong interest in climate change action. And it was a very simple mathematical calculation for me in the end. Can I get more done working with the Conservatives or working with the Liberal Democrats? And in the end, it was a very easy decision.
Okay, well, you did say just now about the internal operation, or your dissatisfaction with the internal operation of the Lib Dem group and party. What did you mean? Can you give some examples?
This is yes, I can. I mean, look, there's a certain amount of backlash I'll get for being very frank about this. I appreciate it, and there'll be accusations, I'm sure, of being a sour grape. Okay, let's use a classic example. The 3,000 homes, and if you recall, a little while ago, we had to return a large amount of the money.
Yes.
The HRA budget. Recall that,
Yeah.
and there was a report written about the reasons for that. Well, that report very conveniently left out that as a member of the previous executive, the full Lib Dem executive, actually knew about that money and the fact that it had to be paid back, and just decided not to tell myself or Caroline. That's the kind of problems I'm talking about. Really huge, gaping lacks of communication, lack of competency, and absolutely astounding breakdown of relationships.
Sorry, you're saying someone in a Lib Dem knew about that?
Yep. And that report was suppressed. That name was suppressed in that report. So much for sleaze and injustice, I note, to protect that person. I mean, it's not rocket science to work it out. I don't think it's appropriate for me to name a person, but you could work it out very easily. It was the previous lead member for housing.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll certainly follow that up. Thank you. And you've given an example now. Now, one senior Lib Dem told me that any divisions within the local Lib Dem party
My fault.
were healed with your departure. Yeah. So do you think that's likely, or do you think, was it just you that was out of step, or are there others too?
I think it's undeniable that I can be a difficult character. I think if I'm being self-reflective, I think my confidence is sometimes teeters on the edge of arrogance. That's a character flaw that I've been confronted with on many occasions, and something I work on. But if my departure has healed anything, that is an indicative of the lack of drive within the party. If I'm the only person who was pushing for things to change, to improve, to do something different, not to rely on old ways or to try and reform, and if that departure of that wish is what makes things heal, then frankly, that's fine by me, but I want no part in that stagnation. And in my opinion, the local Liberal Democrat council group, specifically the council group, has stagnated, and there's a real lack of drive and motion there. And I no longer wanted to be associated with that.
Okay, well, listen, Jan, we on the Dragon will try and help with that arrogant trait and keep your feet on the ground. Okay, so
Martin, I challenge you to find a councillor that's more criticised than me. I think my ego is kept in check at all times. I wouldn't worry too much.
All right, well, we'll see. But I want to switch now to the local plan. What is your personal position on the local plan? Do you think it's a good plan or not?
You know, no one's ever actually asked me that in a public setting. Do I think the current local plan is a good plan? It depends on your metric of good. Is it a good plan for every resident in this borough in managing the development in the borough and the future proofing of this borough? No, it's not a great plan in that respect, but that's mainly because the planning system is fundamentally flawed in my view. And when the rules are there that make it almost impossible to get good results, you can't then be surprised when you get the kind of results. Is it a good plan by the definition of the rules as set out in national policy? Yes, it's actually quite a good plan. And in that regard, the biggest selling point of it is Guildford has got away with a housing number that's lower than it really ought to be. And I think that was a mixture of fortuitous timing, in between the moving of the number in the years between 2014, 2019, some good policy making, some good guidance, good leadership, and it just right place, right time. And I think Guildford's got a good local plan in as far as what a local plan could be under the current legislation. So but it's
very unpopular in certain areas, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think any development management is by definition quite unpopular, because at the heart of it is a slightly philosophical question of and I do this quite a lot, so I apologize. I do tend to take things a little bit to an abstract, but at the heart of it is a question you have to answer, which is that which parts of the borough do you want to see growth? Which parts do you think should be conserved in terms of their character or their size or their aesthetics? And which parts do you think the density should shift? And all these things need to be answered. And in that conversation, people are always going to disagree with some of the conclusions you've reached. And there isn't a singular right or wrong answer. There's just a complete picture you put forward and try and buy consensus on.
But this wasn't a small-scale disagreement with certain.
No, I agree.
This was a huge revolution in Guildford's politics.
Yeah.
So there was widespread discontent over that plan. And of course, the Conservative Party are not only responsible for the plan, they're responsible for the national planning policy. So it is your party that's responsible, isn't it?
Oh, I accept full responsibility. Well, I mean, how can I not? I wrote the second part as well. So I accept full responsibility. I think there's a lot that can be done better. But I think people's anger should be towards the national framework and the way that forces it down our throats, and not necessarily the local the local decisions. Because for all its faults, the previous administration were not stupid. They put forward what they thought were in the best interest, and I genuinely believe that was the outcome.
But one of the things Conservative councillors often put forward, an advantage they have, they say, is good connection and communication with the people in charge at the national level. In fact, David Bilby only said that to me yesterday, or the day before. It didn't work, did it? I mean, they were out of touch, weren't they, with their own voters in these southern constituencies?
Didn't work in the sense that I don't think it's appropriate for there to be a special dispensation for having the same color badge on all three tiers. I don't think that's right. That would, I think, erode the democracy that we try and be a part of here. But I do think there should be a better communication, and I suspect that there was a slight breakdown in that communication. Yeah, probably. I think, but we have to be honest about that there was a failure of communication. I don't think it was a failure of policy. I think it was a failure of communication. Okay.
I mean, it was, in the end, I think it's still rumbling on, and it's still causing problems for your party at local levels.
And certainly I mean, look, I took on the portfolio on day one, knowing almost nothing about planning, but with a very specific purpose that we wanted a clean pair of hands on it, untouched by history or prior allegiance or views. And my specialty from my professional background is that I learn quickly and I can apply complex things quickly to real world scenarios. So I took it on as a fresh pair of hands. And I'm telling you that I arrived largely at the same conclusion. Now, am I saying that if I'd been lead member for planning policy in the last 10 years, I would have made the exact same plan? That's not what I'm saying, but it would have looked incredibly similar, because I just don't think that we have the tools to get the result that people are saying they want without some fundamental changes at the top level of planning policy at national level. We just can't.
Okay. Now, several councillors I've spoken to have blamed you for putting the brakes on the review process. Is that true?
It's actually the opposite. I'm incredibly ready for a review in many ways. So I mean, I can release the emails. Actually, I don't know why I haven't already. Basically, my previous coalition partners, R4GV, wanted to have a number of outcomes, and the issue with a review is you don't go into a review knowing what the answer is. That's how a review works. Otherwise, it's not a review; it's just a change. And I laid out the roadmap of what the various review outcomes could be, and I happen to be comfortable with all of those outcomes. And there is a very real world in which the house, as I know that you've spoken about this before with other councillors, but at the heart of it is the question over the housing numbers. And if it's a mathematical calculation, this is not an opinion right now, looking at the number right now, that number would go up quite significantly. Now, people are arguing, and this is where the opinion comes in, that we could apply extra restrictions onto that to suppress that number. I don't know for certain whether how realistic that outcome is of a suppressed number that would reduce it or limit the uplift in housing delivery numbers. Sorry, housing target numbers. So I presented this to R4GV and said, look, you can take a risk. There's different routes. There's a high risk route that goes for Hail Mary, and we say, let's do a fast review. Let's try it out. And if we but understand that the consequences of that, if it goes wrong and the inspector slaps you down, then you're going to have to allocate more sites. Now, I'm not ready to do that. And I think that's a bad idea. But if that's what you want to do as R4GV based on your manifesto, tell you what, that's okay with me. You have to understand that I'm quite pro-housing in that I'm of a generation that severely lacks housing access to affordable housing. So if I'd like to think I represent a portion of society a little more heavily, I tend to lean on the side of more housing delivery than not. So if the housing number goes up, I'm not necessarily going to cry about it. I think it'd be wrong because I don't think it'd be appropriate, but I'm not going to shed a tear. I think there was another route, which was a much more slow and steady paced route of review and say, let's take our time. Let's see where the national population statistics land at the national level and see what the fallout from that is. Let's wait to see what the environmental bill does. Let's bide our time and only make a real push for a review when we think we have the deck stacked in our favor. That was my personal view. Let's see what happens next.
Okay. Now, isn't that view of yours that you've just expressed about being sympathetic to the need for more housing, isn't that one that actually exists in quite a few Liberal Democrats' minds, even though they don't like to admit it?
I would hope so. I mean, look, I think I'm going to speak my mind because I always do. I think that Guildford is quite a NIMBY place. I'm not accusing individuals of being NIMBY, but I think there's a very NIMBY approach, which I completely get. Guildford is one of the most beautiful boroughs. It's one of the most wooded parts of the country in the entire. It's actually one of the most wooded parts of the entire Europe. Parts of Poland beat us by margin, but nonetheless, we live in a beautiful countryside that needs to be protected and cherished. And I get it. People want to preserve their local villages and towns, and even Guildford itself. And I understand that completely. But I think we have our part to play as a society to ensure that the next generation have access to housing. People I know are paying up to 60% of their income on rent, and I just don't think that's right. So do I think building more houses will fix that? Not necessarily, but I think it's a part of the solution. So anything that works toward that outcome, I'm in favor of. And I would hope that Liberal Democrats and Conservatives and anyone else would see that. Okay,
but all private housing is going to be subject to market forces and will remain unaffordable to most people, well, to the people that existing within the borough that need
I agree. I don't think just building the houses is enough. There's other things that need to be done in conjunction with that.
Okay, all right, let's move on. So I want to look at your relationship with Paul Spooner, because you know the history here. You made some very critical comments of your now leader, Paul Spooner. Those that witnessed probably won't be able to easily forget how angry you became when you blamed him for criticizing the attendance record of then a fellow Lib Dem councillor. You said, to remind you, shame on you, you should know better. Your lack of compassion speaks to your character. You also said Councillor Nigel Manning's comments on the same subject were despicable. Is it all forgotten now? All hearts and flowers between you all?
Well, I mean, look, I would like to think I disagree with my fellow Councillor Spooner on a weekly basis. In fact, I think we make it a point to have a good discussion on a topic at least once a week. But that's right. We're not here to parrot each other and to all link up arms and present some united front of what the Conservative Party wants or thinks is necessary. We're individuals. We have our own beliefs and moral principles and standards. And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this wasn't just a normal debate in the council chamber, even one of higher temper than normal. This was an outstandingly bad-tempered statement by you. You could see from your face how angry you were.
Are you familiar with the full details of that incident and the reason why
I believe so. I don't think they've been made public, other than I believe
I would rather not.
No, okay, but the councillor in question had understandable reasons, as far as I'm aware.
Extremely understandable reasons, and I think at the time I don't think the Conservatives were aware of that, and I was under the impression that they were, and they were yet still making political points. It turns out that the information hadn't propagated itself that far, and so their comments were made, I think, in partial ignorance, and I think lost my cool, which, as we know, is neither new.
No, okay. So what about the future now? What are your political ambitions from here on in?
This is the favorite topic of, I think, of everyone in the council. I don't have political ambitions at this time. To be honest with you, I think the Conservatives would very strongly like me to stand again in Merrow. I haven't said yes yet.
To stand in Merrow?
Yeah.
It might not be the safest of seats, especially for you.
That's not how I make decisions. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure well, let's just put it this way. My wife would very much prefer if I didn't run again ever,
Right,
and
okay.
didn't partake in politics ever again, I think. People are not very nice, which doesn't bother me as much, but I think for people around me, I think it's shocking how much the limelight is, and how critical it is, shall we say. And certainly, again, I don't know if you're aware of the story of how I came to be a councillor, but I'm largely here by mistake, to be honest with you, in that no Liberal Democrat had ever met me before asking me to stand. There was a half an hour gap between me filling an online form and having a phone call saying, would you be a candidate for us? That was it. No one met me. It was a cursory chat. So it's not.
Were you a Lib Dem member?
I think I was still a recurring Lib Dem member from my student days. I think it's a £1 membership. So I think technically I probably still was at the time. But I certainly had unsubscribed from as many of the newsletters as you can get, because they were filling my inbox at an alarming rate.
Okay. And so, right, so you've explained how you got recruited, but you did have an ambition to remain on the GBC executive as the lead member for climate change. Wasn't that naive? There was no way, was there, that the Lib Dems were going to allow that to happen?
Why not?
Because they don't like you anymore, Jan.
That's my point. Is
they regard you as a traitor? That's why.
I'm sure they do. But one of the critical. I said there wasn't any one decision that event that pushed me, but there was one conversation about 2 days before I made my final decision, where I was talking about building a climate change group and consensus around it. It was some topic. Anyway, I was talking about building a relationship with the Conservatives at county level. And a senior Lib Dem said, no, I won't work with them. I know what they're all like. And at that moment, I knew that I was never going to get anywhere as long as that mindset prevailed. So if that's the mindset, fine, I understand. But you can't fault me for exposing myself and saying, look, I'm willing to do this role. I think I can do it. I think I'm good at it. Despite the criticism that I face, retrospective rewriting of history, which I'm enjoying. I am willing to do it. I will work with anyone. I don't care what your political affiliation at the local level is, or at the national level for that matter. I will work with you because I think that's in the best interest of Guildford.
Okay, and so how are you finding your new political group now? Where are you in its pecking order?
Pecking order. Well, I have to say that the welcome has been incredible in the sense that I've already settled in very easily, but it's a difficult thing, you know. These are people I've sat across the room from, and has been the political games we've played in the chamber. So to turn around, you would expect a certain level of friction, but I haven't found it so far. As I say, it's been very welcoming, and I find that actually, on the whole, it's been my personal experience, and entirely an opinion, that the Conservative group works very hard, much harder than I'm used to as a collective.
Okay, and how do you see your new party faring in local politics over the next few years? In particular, perhaps the next borough council election.
Well, I think it'll be it depends on and to a certain extent the national picture. But at the local, if we just focus on local issues, I think people are going to realise that planning is not a thing you can solve. You can make all the manifesto pledges you want, but it's not something you click your fingers and you solve. And I note, of course, that the DMP policies that were adopted were largely unchanged from the ones that I oversaw. So it's not like my removal sort of paved the way for some great rewriting of history or some grand reforms. They were exactly as I put them forward. So I think when the population realizes that, they will look to see what has this administration actually achieved. And so far, it's not a lot. It's my personal opinion. I mean, I do appreciate there's extraordinary difficult circumstances with the budgetary constraints, but from a housing perspective, from a delivery perspective, I'm not seeing anything.
Okay. Now, I said we'd come back to climate change, and I know
Sure.
that is something you do feel very strongly about. And you said in your opinion piece that you wrote for The Dragon that I genuinely believe working with the Conservative Party locally, regionally and nationally has the best chance of delivering real, tangible action on climate change. Do you still believe that? And can you say why you believe that?
I do believe that for one very simple reason. I think, and this is something I've seen increasingly over the last few years, that the climate change topic has been weaponized in the political sphere. It's become a tool, and the Lib Dems and the Greens and Labour to a certain extent have attempted to own the subject matter. And this notion that if you can only be an environmentalist if you're not a conservative, as if there's somehow mutually exclusive ideologies. And I think it's hugely damaging to the cause, in that it alienates a huge portion of the population. It also alienates the businesses, and these are precisely the people we need on board. So my main objective going forward is to try and rebrand this in a way that actually, you know what, these are not opposed ideologies. I think conservatism and environmentalism are the same thing. They're so closely aligned. And in fact, a lot of the good environmentalist initiatives that what I think we should be pursuing make a lot of business sense, make a lot of personal sense, don't infringe on your personal freedoms or unduly taxatious. I think the Conservatives need to do a better job of explaining that and selling environmental action to their core voter base. And I would like to be a part of that, because without that, without the core Conservative voter base getting on board with the agenda, we're not going to see progress.
Okay, and I mean, one could say, I presume that, you know, if this is really a global challenge, which I think most people now accept it is, yep, it should transcend politics, shouldn't it?
I agree. It should transcend politics. To be honest with you, for me, it's not really about conservatism or liberal. It's not an ideological issue. It's not a left or right issue. It's for me, it's about this sounds cheesy now. It's just about moving forward. It's about identifying the right actions and moving forward. I think there's a tendency to get lost in just the discussion of climate change. And this is very typical of Guildford Borough Council, for example. We endlessly want to talk about it, but there isn't necessarily a drive to actually change anything at a fundamental level, which is why I was so keen when I was lead member to focus on not the low-hanging fruit, not stuff that looks good, but take things at the high level. The prime example, my biggest focus, was decarbonising the grid in Guildford. A huge challenge, not something that can be done overnight, but an absolute focus of mine. And it's not easy, and it will take years and years. But I like to start from the top, not from the bottom. That's my approach to climate change.
Okay, Cllr Jan Harwood, I've allowed this to run on for nearly 30 minutes now, which is longer than normal, but I personally found it interesting, and I appreciate you being frank, and I hope others find it interesting too, and can understand more of your position having listened to it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin. Take care.